Great to have you with us. A couple things before we get started. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All books on our tour are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller over in Falmouth. We hope you go visit them. And if you use the chat feature down below when it comes time to ask questions, and mute yourself so we can listen to our speaker. Lew Paper is a former politician. He's a former adjunct professor at Georgetown. He's authored 6 books. He's coming to us, I believe, from New Jersey, Mr. Paper. Is that true?
No, that's not true. I haven't been in New Jersey in decades.
Okay.
I'm actually right now in Florida, in Naples, Florida. New
Like
Jersey is a part of my past that I don't discuss much.
I'm not going there. So, as you people know that have been tuning in with me, I have to relay a little story before we start. Lew was telling me that he wasn't sure that it was a good thing if he shared his screen, so he wanted me to do this, and he had some pictures he wanted to show. I said, no, we can wait, and there's a video he wants to show, so I'm gonna do it from my screen. As everyone knows, our last 2 talks, the Thursday night and last night, the technology gods have not been good to me. So I realize that the NHL playoffs are about to start and the Bruins. I was not going to go for the hat trick. So let's hope that I can pull this one off. Would you welcome our guest today, Lew Paper? But first, I also want to show you a little video. So please keep your fingers crossed. Yeah. All right, would you welcome our speaker tonight, Lew Paper?
All right, well, thanks, Mark. First of all, I want to thank Mark for the invitation to speak at the Museums on the Green. And I also want to thank him for making that effort with a video, because when we talked about it and he asked me if I would do it, I said I was not technologically adept. And I recognize my own weaknesses. So I'm glad he took the initiative, and I appreciate him doing that. And so first of all, can everybody see me? If not, just let me know. But I'm assuming that everybody can see me and hear me. So I do want to, again, thank Mark for the invitation to be with you. I've spent a lot of time on Cape Cod, but I have to say it's been some years since I've been there. So it's great to be back in Cape Cod, even if it is virtual. So enough of personal matters. Pearl Harbor. We've all seen the film of President Franklin D. Roosevelt standing in the well of the United States House of Representatives on December 8, 1941. Saying that December 7, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy because of Japan's surprise attack on the US naval base in Pearl Harbor. There's no evidence that President Roosevelt or his cabinet knew in advance that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. But they should not have been surprised that Japan would directly attack the United States. In November 1941, only a few weeks before Pearl Harbor, Joseph Grew sent a telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull to warn him that Japan was prepared to launch a suicidal war against the United States, and that armed conflict could come with dangerous and dramatic suddenness. And on November 30, 1941, Joseph Grew wrote in his diary, "If war should come, I hope history will not overlook that telegram." So who was Joseph Grew? And why did he send that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in November 1941? In November 1941, Joseph Grew was 61 years old, tall, lean, bushy eyebrows, a full mustache. He had been an American diplomat for almost 40 years, and he had been America's ambassador to Japan in Tokyo for almost 10 years. There were 4 factors which led Grew to send that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in November 1941. The first factor was the Japanese economy. The United States had imposed economic sanctions on Japan in an effort to curb Japan's military aggression in China and Southeast Asia. Those economic sanctions had crippled the Japanese economy. Rice was being rationed. There was no gasoline for cars. The few cars that traversed Tokyo streets had to be fitted with a charcoal engine. Imported coffee was also unavailable. It had been replaced by another brew, about which the New York Times correspondent said it was better not to ask too many questions. There was a second factor, which led Joseph Grew to send that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in November 1941. And that was the Japanese mindset. Grew knew that a crippled economy would lead to a sense of desperation among the Japanese, and a sense of desperation would lead to war. It was all part of that samurai do-or-die spirit which still prevailed in Japan. Grew knew that for Japanese leaders, annihilation through a suicidal war with the United States was better than the humiliation of succumbing to American pressure. There's a story which illustrates that Japanese mindset. In the fall of 1941, Grew received word from the American embassy in China about a Japanese soldier who had been captured by Chinese troops in the fighting there. The Japanese soldier came from a well-to-do family, and he wanted his family back in Japan to know that he was alive and well. Grew passed the word on to the Japanese government, and he soon received a reply. The government said that neither it nor this man's family were interested. As far as they were concerned, that Japanese soldier was dead. Because, said the government, any Japanese soldier who had allowed himself to be captured had dishonored his family and dishonored his government. There was a third factor, which led Joseph Grew to send that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in November 1941. And that was the Japanese leaders' ability to control the Japanese population. If I was writing a book about Nazi Germany, I would not have to explain to you the brutality of the government. Japan was also a very repressive society. Secret police were everywhere. Surveillance was pervasive. No dissent was allowed. An indiscreet word uttered to a friend, a neighbor, a family member, and a person could find themselves arrested, thrown in jail, and subjected to horrific torture. Grew understood the upshot of all this. If Japanese leaders issued a command to launch a suicidal war against the United States, the Japanese people would obey that command and they would fight to the death. There was a fourth factor, which led Joseph Grew to send that telegram to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in November 1941. And that revolved around discussions which Japanese representatives were having with Hull in Washington, D.C., to explore a possible agreement between Japan and the United States that would resolve the differences between the two countries. Notwithstanding that samurai do-or-die spirit, Japanese leaders understood the risk of war with the United States. And so they supported an initiative in the spring of 1941 to have discussions with Hull in Washington to see if the two countries could reach an agreement. For his part, Secretary of State Cordell Hull knew there was virtually no chance of Japan and the United States entering into an agreement. Hull regarded Japan as one of the worst international desperados in the history of mankind. He subscribed to the view that no words of the Japs, as he called them, on paper would be worth anything. But Hull could not tell that directly to the Japanese representatives who came to Washington. Why? Because in the spring of 1941, America's military capabilities were woefully inadequate. And so President Roosevelt and the military chiefs urged Hull to drag out the conversations with the Japanese people, the representatives, as long as possible, to give the United States time to bolster its military capabilities and to avoid a war in the Pacific for which the United States was not prepared. And so that's what Hull did. From the spring into the summer and then the fall of 1941, he spent untold hours talking with the Japanese representatives about an agreement that he knew would never come to fruition. By November 1941, Grew had reported to Hull that Japanese leaders were very frustrated about the lack of progress in the discussions, that Japanese leaders were beginning to sense that the United States was not really interested in an agreement, and that the United States was merely playing for time. But for Japan, time was running out. In those months before Pearl Harbor, Grew made many recommendations to President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull about things they could do that he thought would decrease the chance of war. Very few of these recommendations were acknowledged. None was accepted. Why? Because back in the United States, and especially in Washington, people could not believe that Japan would attack the United States. The United States was so much larger in terms of population and resources. People thought it would be utterly stupid for Japan to attack the United States. And so, as Grew would later write, American policy in those months before Pearl Harbor was completely inflexible, and that his reporting to the government was like throwing pebbles into a lake at night. When Pearl Harbor occurred, as you might imagine, Joseph Grew was very frustrated and bitter because he believed that if his recommendations had been accepted, there was a chance that war could have been avoided. As soon as Pearl Harbor occurred, Grew and the other members of the American embassy were arrested. They were taken as prisoners of war. They were all placed in the American embassy in Tokyo, and they were held there for about 6 months while the United States and Japan negotiated a diplomatic exchange agreement so that American diplomats in Japan could return to the United States and Japanese diplomats in the United States could return to Japan. In the 6 months that he was held as a prisoner of war, Grew wrote a 60-page report which detailed his criticism of American policy in those months before Pearl Harbor. Grew planned to give that report to President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull when he returned to the United States. But it never happened. Grew returned to the United States on August 25, 1942. He came by ship. He was accompanied by his private secretary, a recent Yale graduate. The ship docked in New York. As soon as the ship docked, Grew and his private secretary took a train to Washington, D.C. And on the morning of August 26, 1942, Grew and his private secretary went to Hull's offices, which were located in the State War and Navy building, which is located next to the White House. Grew's private secretary waited in the outer office while Grew went into Hull's private office by himself. Grew's private secretary could not hear the entire conversation between Hull and Grew, but he could hear through the door Hull yelling at Grew. After about 30 minutes, Grew emerged from Hull's private office. He clearly looked shaken. He suggested to his private secretary that they adjourn for lunch at the nearby Metropolitan Club. At lunch, Grew told his secretary what had happened. Grew gave Hull that 60-page report that he had drafted while he was a prisoner of war. Hull glanced at the report. He saw that it criticized decisions and statements which Hull had made in those months before Pearl Harbor. Hull immediately demanded that Grew destroy the report. Grew did not want to destroy the document. He told Hull that it was his confidential report to his superiors. Hull remained adamant. He told Grew to go home, think about it, and come back the next morning and tell him whether he would destroy that report. As a practical matter, Grew felt he had no choice. He was a subordinate official in the State Department, and he believed that he had to yield to Hull's demand. And so the following morning, Grew went back to Hull's office and he told him that he would destroy the report. I should add that there's no evidence that President Roosevelt knew about the report or its destruction. For his part, Grew never publicly acknowledged the destruction of the report, not even when he was asked in a post-war congressional hearing whether he had prepared any report to give to Hull upon his return to the United States. There's a certain irony in all this. When he came back to the United States, Grew remained in the State Department. Hull resigned in November 1944. President Roosevelt appointed a new Secretary of State, and he appointed Joseph Grew as Undersecretary of State, which meant that Joseph Grew was now the #2 man in the State Department. Throughout much of 1945, Grew was the acting Secretary of State because the Secretary of State was on travel outside of Washington. And here's the irony. In August 1945, Joseph Grew, the diplomat who had worked so hard to avoid war between Japan and the United States, was the acting Secretary of State when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So how did I come to write this book about Joseph Grew and Pearl Harbor? We have to go back to the beginning. I have always loved to write. When I was a senior at the University of Michigan, I wrote my thesis, my honors thesis on John Kennedy. It provided a new look into his presidency. It was entitled John F. Kennedy, The Promise and the Performance. It was 165 pages long. My professors told me it was really good and that it deserved to be published as a book. Who was I to argue? And so getting that thesis published as a book became a cherished goal. After I graduated from Michigan, I spent the summer in Washington, D.C. as an intern with the Office of Education. One morning, I was flipping through a magazine and I saw an advertisement. It was from Pageant Press. It said, "Publisher looking for authors." That was me. And so I sent Pageant Press my thesis and asked them to publish it as a book. Now I have to pause here to say that in those days, self-publishing did not have the respect it does today. In those days, self-publishing was called the vanity press, and it was frowned upon in traditional publishing circles. But I knew none of that. In any event, as the summer was drawing to a close and I was getting ready to go to law school, I called Pageant Press to ask what had happened about the status of my thesis. The woman who answered the phone said that they had sent a contract to my house. I immediately called my home in New Jersey, and there you go, Mark. I was from New Jersey, and I called my house in New Jersey, and I spoke to my mother, and I asked if we had received anything from Pageant Press, and she said, yes, there's a package here. And I asked her to open it up, and she said, it's a contract. Needless to say, I was very excited. I asked her to read me some of the provisions. One of the provisions said that I would have a 50% royalty rate, which meant that I would get half of the income from the sale of the book. I knew absolutely nothing about the publishing industry, but that sounded like a very high royalty rate. So I decided that I needed to talk to somebody who did know something about the publishing world. The only person I could think of was Ben Bradley, the executive editor of the Washington Post. I had interviewed Bradley the year before when I was conducting research for my thesis. We had a great conversation. I thought he was a very cool guy. Hair slicked back, an immaculate dresser, a cigarette dangling from his mouth. He swore like the sailor he once was, and he was an intimate friend of John Kennedy's. And as I say, we spent a couple of hours talking. When we finished, he gave me a copy of the book he had written after John Kennedy had been assassinated. The book was called That Special Grace. It's a very warm book. In any event, I called Bradley to ask him about the royalty rate from Pageant Press. Bradley got on the phone and I explained the situation. And he said, yes, that royalty rate sounded awfully high. And he wondered whether Pageant Press was part of the vanity press. And so he suggested that I check the contract to see if Pageant Press was asking me to make a payment to them to publish my thesis. So after hanging up with Bradley, I called my home again and spoke to my mother. I asked her to look at the contract, and sure enough, there was a provision asking me to pay Pageant Press $5,000. Well, obviously, I couldn't be part of that, and so that was the end of my relationship with Pageant Press. But I did not give up. Over the next couple of years, I spent a lot of time researching and expanding my thesis, so it was a much longer product at this point. I then secured a literary agent. The literary agent sent the manuscript to a lot of publishers. The publishers all sent letters back rejecting the manuscript. But in doing that, many of the letters said, this is a great book, or great manuscript. It deserves to be published, but they said the market for books about John Kennedy is saturated, and we don't think another book about John Kennedy can sell well. After a while, my literary agent gave up, but I did not. And I continued to send letters to publishers asking if they would publish this manuscript. I got a lot of letters back, all rejecting the manuscript. In fact, I probably could have wallpapered the wall of my apartment with all the rejection letters I got. But many of them said what the other publishers had said, that this was a great proposal, a great book, that it deserved to be published, but the market for books about John Kennedy was saturated. Not knowing anything about the publishing industry, I thought that these publishers had objective evidence to know that the market for books about John Kennedy was saturated. But I ultimately concluded and realized there was no objective evidence. It really was nothing more than a couple of people sitting around a table and saying, what do you think? And then concluding that, hey, the market's saturated for books about John Kennedy. In due course, I received a letter from Crown Publishers, which was a very large publisher in New York. And like the other publishers, they rejected the manuscript. But like many of the other publishers, they said, this is a great book. It deserves to be published, but the market on books about John Kennedy is saturated. They did add, however, that if I had not sold the book within a year, I should check back with them and they would review the situation again. At this point, I had had enough. I picked up the phone and I called the editor at Crown Publishers. And I asked them, how did you conclude that the market for books about John Kennedy was saturated? And as I expected, he said, well, we sat around a table and we looked at each other and we said, hey, the market for books about John Kennedy is saturated. I asked if he would entertain opinions from other people who felt otherwise. He said he would because they would like to publish the book. After hanging up with the Crown editor, I sent out about 20 letters to people, some of whom I knew, some of whom I did not know, but all of whom were people whose opinions I thought the Crown editor would respect. These were history professors, book editors, journalists. They all said the same thing. The book looked like a great proposal, and that the market for books about John Kennedy was not saturated, and that a book like this could sell well. I took all those opinions from those 20 people. I digested them in a letter or summarized them in a letter that I sent to the Crown editor. And within a week, he sent me a contract to publish my now expanded thesis called John F. Kennedy, The Promise and the Performance. So getting a book published after that was a lot easier. I did a biography of Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. I did a biography of Bill Paley, the founder of CBS. I also did a book about Don Larson's Perfect Game, in the 1956 World Series between the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. About 8 years ago, I was thinking of doing another book. This one would be about America in 1941. It was a pivotal year for the country. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been inaugurated for an unprecedented third term as president. The UAW signed its first contract with a car manufacturer. The New York Yankees, Joe DiMaggio, hit safely in 56 consecutive games, a record which still stands. And, of course, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In the course of my research, I came across the name of Joseph Grew and his effort to orchestrate an agreement between Japan and the United States to avoid the war he saw coming. I was intrigued, and the more I researched, the more I realized that Joseph Grew's story had never been told. So I switched gears to tell that story. In writing this book, I wanted to bring the characters to life for the reader. Take President Roosevelt. He's a central figure in this drama. When you see those films of President Roosevelt standing in the well of the United States House of Representatives on December 8, 1941, saying that December 7, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy. He looks so strong. He sounds so vibrant. And yet, here was a man who had been stricken by polio and could not walk. So I was thinking about it. You and I, we get up in the morning, we go to the bathroom, we do our business, we come back, we get dressed, and we go about our day. Roosevelt could not do those things without assistance. And that assistance was not provided by his wife, Eleanor. She had her own bedroom down the hall in the White House. And more than that, she was almost always traveling. Instead, Roosevelt relied on a valet. Roosevelt had 2 valets during his 12 years in the White House. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could find some commentary from those valets about what Roosevelt was really like in those private moments with his valet. And I was able to find that commentary. I learned that in those private moments with his valet, Roosevelt almost always displayed a sweet, amiable disposition. Roosevelt's valet in December 1941 was Arthur Prettyman, a big black man who was a chief petty officer in the United States Navy. Prettyman was also a very good-looking guy. And although Prettyman was married, Roosevelt liked to tease him about being a lady killer. And every time Roosevelt would tease Prettyman about being a lady killer, Prettyman would respond, "One does not refute the chief executive, Mr. President." I wanted to provide that same intimacy in talking about Joseph Grew. To do that, I talked to many members of his family, his grandchildren, his cousins, his great-grandchildren. They told me many stories that were useful. One story stood out in particular because it displayed Grew's stature and his diplomatic skills. It was January 1949. Grew was asked to provide some remarks at a dinner that was being held in honor of General George C. Marshall, who was retiring as Secretary of State. General Marshall had been Chief of the Army during World War II. After the war, Truman had appointed him as Secretary of State. And now, in January 1949, General Marshall is going to retire to his farm in Virginia with his wife. At the dinner was General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his wife, Mamie. In his closing remarks about General Marshall, Grew said all he wants to do is retire to his farm in Virginia with Mrs. Eisenhower. Well, as soon as Grew said that, people began to laugh. Grew immediately recognized his mistake and quickly and coolly said, "My apologies to the general." At that point, General Eisenhower blurted out, "Which general?" I wanted to provide that same intimacy in talking about Joseph Grew. In addition to talking to members of Grew's family, I also had access to a lot of documents. No document was more important than Grew's diary. This guy was incredibly disciplined. Almost every evening during the week and on the weekends, he would sit at his desk, his pipe clenched between his teeth, his Smith Corona typewriter in front of him, and he would type out what had been said, what had been done, what he thought in the previous day. I had access to thousands of pages of Grew's diary. I knew almost everything he did, everything he said, and everything he thought in those months before Pearl Harbor. I knew what time he got up in the morning. I knew that his favorite Scotch whiskey was Johnny Walker Red. And I knew too about his very deep feelings for his wife, Alice. And in fact, in many respects, this book is a love story. When Joseph Grew married Alice Perry in 1905, she was a tall, vivacious, beautiful woman with long, dark hair. Alice came from a prominent family in Boston, but she had little formal education, in part because her family was almost always traveling. But Alice was very smart, and Alice had a lot of opinions, and Alice wanted to share those opinions with her husband. And he was willing to listen. Grew told his daughters that he rarely made an important decision or sent out an important communication without consulting Alice. But Alice was a formidable force in her own right. That was illustrated by a story told by Grew's private secretary. It concerned a social evening at the American Embassy in Tokyo shortly before Pearl Harbor. The Grews invited over for dinner Sir Robert Craigie, the British ambassador to Japan, and his wife, Lady Craigie. The Grews liked Sir Robert Craigie. The Grews did not like Lady Craigie. They thought she was a nasty woman. In any event, at these social occasions at the American Embassy, the Grews would often show a movie after dinner. The problem was the projector they used to show the movie was almost always breaking down. And so on this particular occasion, as the Grews and the Craigies were watching a movie after dinner, the projector again broke down. When it did, Lady Craigie turned to Alice and said, "Isn't it unfortunate, my dear, that machine of yours is always breaking down?" Without skipping a beat, Alice turned to Lady Craigie and said, "Yes, but isn't it great that we have no important guests tonight?" I tried to provide that same intimacy in talking about the other characters in this drama, both American and Japanese. And if you read this book, In the Cauldron, you will see that the attack at Pearl Harbor was not merely a clash of governments. It was the product of the personalities, the perspectives, and the prejudices of people like you and me. And if you read this book, it will change the way you look at Pearl Harbor. So again, I want to thank Mark, and I want to thank each of you for coming. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you, Lou. That was great. If anybody's got any questions, make sure you use the chat feature down below. Obviously, Grew had his opinions, and which were different than Cordell Hull's. Given the fact, I'm going to take an opposite tack, I suppose. Given the fact that Washington knew how Japan had acted in the 1930s, they had attacked Manchuria, they had attacked the rape of Nanking, they were in Korea, uh, and they had seen what had happened in Germany in Nuremberg. Do you think that maybe that Hull and others were more concerned and didn't want to, and they were worried about appeasement, let's say so I think were they more concerned about Japan than maybe Gru was privy to?
No, I don't think the United States really feared Japan. First of all, let me take a step back. Roosevelt, at this time in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, was very focused on Hitler in Germany and helping Great Britain. That's where his focus was. And he largely deferred to Hull when it came to Japan because, as I say, his principal energies were focused on Europe and not on Japan. But I will say this, that what colored, and I should say that Roosevelt, I think, might have taken a different approach than Hull, but Hull was really the one driving the policy here. And I think uppermost in addition to the matters I mentioned, Hull's opinion of the Japanese, Hull's opinion was also colored by Munich. As I'm sure all of you know, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, had gone to Czechoslovakia in 1938 and had a conference with Hitler and came back with a piece of paper that Hitler had signed saying, we now have peace in our time. And Hitler has agreed not to be engaged in any more military aggression, which obviously turned out not to be the case. And so Hull was afraid that entering into an agreement with Japan would be a second Munich. And Hull would repeatedly say, I was opposed to the first Munich, and I certainly didn't want a second Munich. And so that's one of the principal reasons why he really did not want to have an agreement with Japan, because he was afraid, first of all, it wouldn't be effective in preventing war. And second of all, he was afraid that there would be a tremendous backlash among the American public.
As you were researching it and coming across Gru's papers, were you aware of his opinions before, and how do you support his opinions? I mean, do you think that Gru ultimately was correct, or obviously it's a theory, but would you have taken Gru's tactic, or to a course of action?
Well, let me explain Gru's perspective. Gru was a diplomat, and so he believed that as a diplomat, it was his obligation to try and preserve harmonious relationships between countries and to avoid war. And so that was his mission. Gru didn't necessarily believe that an agreement. First of all, he didn't know and didn't necessarily believe that Japan and the United States could enter into an agreement, although he thought there was a chance of it. And he couldn't be sure that an agreement would prevent war between Japan and the United States. But that was his mission. And so I think that he felt that he believed that the United States, that Roosevelt and Hull could have done other things that might have avoided Pearl Harbor, might have avoided war with Japan. And so that was his, as I say, his mission as a diplomat. And I would say this, that on the ship, when Gru was coming back by ship from Japan to the United States, and I explained how he ultimately landed in New York. While he was on that ship, he drafted a letter to Roosevelt. It was a 15-page letter. And in the letter, it was a cover letter in which Gru would give Roosevelt that 60-page report, which I mentioned in my talk. And in that letter, Gru said to Roosevelt, I think it would be useful for you to read this report, because I think it will be perused, as he said, used the word perused, by future historians on whether Pearl Harbor and war with Japan could have been avoided. So that's where Gru is coming from. And so I don't know that I have any real opinion. It's really hard to say, because I think there's a chance that war might have been avoided. But like I say, there were a lot of factors which militated against the United States entering into an agreement.
And we got a question here. How was Gru treated when he was a prisoner of war for those 6 months?
Actually, they were treated generally pretty well. They were held in the American embassy, but there were a lot of restrictions. Their movements were restricted. All of their communications were restricted. They were treated not nearly as well as the Japanese diplomats were. The Japanese diplomats were, I think, placed in a beautiful hotel. I forget which the name of it now, down in Virginia. The Japanese diplomats were treated very well. So they weren't tortured or anything, but like I say, they were very restricted and they couldn't communicate with any the outside world.
This has always been the big conspiracy question. Obviously, Washington had been warned that something was going to go on in Pearl Harbor. Why did no one listen?
Well, as I said, there was no evidence that Roosevelt or his cabinet knew in advance that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. There's lots of books out there. There's lots of articles about various things that happened, communications that were sent that should have alerted people to the fact that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor. And you can read it, there's a lot of that. And I guess in retrospect, you can pick up all the tea leaves and see what Japan was doing. But I've looked at the most private communication, penciled notes between Hull and Roosevelt, summaries of conversations between Roosevelt and his cabinet, and there's no evidence that they knew that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor. More than that, it really it's not logical, because if Roosevelt did know that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, then, let's suppose he did know about it and didn't want to stop it and decided that he would use it as a vehicle to become involved with war against Japan, not Germany, this is Japan. What would he have done? Logic says he probably should have made sure the people, the naval and army commanders in Pearl Harbor were prepared. They were on alert so that when the Japanese attacked, the Japanese planes could have been destroyed, and he would have looked like a hero because the United States had demonstrated its superiority in armed conflict. Instead, the Army and the Navy personnel in Pearl Harbor were not at all prepared for attack. And in fact, in the morning of December 7, 1941, Husband Kimmel, the naval commander, and Walter Short, the Army commander, they were getting ready to go out to play golf. And they were called back when they received reports about the Japanese attack. And like I say, if Roosevelt had known about the attack, I would think that he would have done something so they were better prepared.
You mentioned that Gru became the #2 guy in the State Department, and he was the #2 man when the atomic bomb was dropped. What was his feelings on the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Was he in favor of that, or what did he write about that?
He didn't write about that. I think he felt, I will tell you two things. First of all, he felt that Truman made that decision, and he understood the reasons why Truman did that. Truman did that because if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, there were likely to be hundreds of thousands of American casualties in the invasion of Japan. He knew about that. And they were preparing for the invasion of Japan. And they were told that, as I say, there would be hundreds of thousands of casualties. So I think Gru understood Truman's rationale for wanting to avoid those kinds of casualty. The only thing I will say is one thing Gru did do that had an impact was he argued that in any post-war Japan, that Japan should be allowed to keep the emperor. Japan had an emperor who was revered as the son of God. And there was some talk when MacArthur took over the occupation of Japan, MacArthur was thinking about getting rid of the monarchy, getting rid of the emperor, and creating a wholly new kind of government in Japan. And Gru successfully argued to MacArthur that if you keep the emperor and the emperor is in favor of what it is you're doing, the Japanese people are more likely to support it and be cooperative than if they don't have the emperor there. And so ultimately, as you all probably know, the emperor did remain in place, and he remained in place for years thereafter.
How long did it take for you to work on this? And what's next in the pipeline for you?
Well, it took me a long time. As I said, I started writing this book about 8 years. It took a good 5 or 6 years of research. As you might imagine, there's a tremendous amount of documents out there about Pearl Harbor. There's a lot of books. And I wanted to make sure, first of all, that whatever I said was accurate. And second of all, I wanted to make sure, as I thought it was, and as I think it is, different from all the other books that have been written about Pearl Harbor. And so it took a lot of painstaking research. So as I say, it took about 5 or 6 years. I have not yet settled on my next book. I'm thinking about it and talking to my literary agent about it, but I'm hoping to reach a decision soon. By the way, Mark, I should mention that if anybody who is listening to this is interested in buying the book and having me sign it, they can go to my website, lewpaper.com, Lewpaper, lewpaper.com. And they can read reviews about the book, of course. And they can contact me and they can send the book to me, and I will take care of signing it and taking care of postage to send it back.
That's good to know. Thank you very much for doing this tonight. It's been a great pleasure having you here. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for sending the link to the video. Good luck with this book. And again, stay safe down in Florida or New Jersey, whenever you go back to New Jersey. Everybody else, stay safe. Thank you for joining us tonight. So good night, everyone. Thank you, Lew. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.